QSO Today, episode 361, Antoine De Ramon NYeurt 3D2AG. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest HF, VHF, and UHF transceivers and accessories for the radio amateur, reminding you that ICOM now has some unique and effective communication solutions for EMCOM. My thanks to ICOM America for their support of the QSO Today podcast. The QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo is coming again on August 14th and 15th. We have a lineup of over 90 amazing presentations now, interesting exhibitors, 2 build-a-thons, and prizes. Entry to the exhibit hall is free, and full convention passes that include the 30-day on-demand period are available at an early bird discount price of $10. We are back on the VFairs platform that we used last August, and we guarantee a smooth and flawless experience. In fact, we will be offering a test run of the Expo at the end of July. Please stay tuned. After all of these years, I hired a full-stack developer to integrate my system for taking sponsorship and donations and displaying those listener sponsors on the QSO Today website. If you agreed to allow me to publicly thank you for your support, then your name will appear listed on the sponsors page of the QSO Today website. The amount next to your name and call sign is the total support that you have given since I started the podcast in 2014. Listener support through sponsorships, donations, transcriptions, affiliate links, and buying a ticket to the Expo make all of the QSO Today projects that we are doing for the amateur radio community possible. While I can't thank supporters enough, I hope to rectify the lack of public recognition with the new features to the sponsors page on the website. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Uthfor-Z1UG, your host. With only 3 hams in paradise, Antoine De Ramon NYeurt 3D2AG holds up the CW representation from Fiji, the largest island in the South Pacific. Antoine gave an excellent presentation last March at the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo about operating from Fiji and Rotuma, another island 600 kilometers north of Fiji. 3D2AG shares his ham radio life in this QSO Today. 3D2AG, this is Eric for Z1UG. Are you there, Antoine?
Yes, good morning, Eric. Nice to hear you.
Antoine, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Before we start, we're speaking right now over Zoom from Israel to Fiji in the South Pacific. Can you describe a little bit about Fiji, its people and its industry, and how you happen to be there?
Fiji is an island in the South Pacific. It's actually the largest island in the Southern Hemisphere if you don't count Australia and New Zealand. And we have about just under 1 million population. And the main industry here is sugar and also tourism. Right now, because of COVID-19, both are down, but this is the main economic resource. And I've been here since 1978. Actually was born in India in 1967. I moved to France for about 6-7 years and came here when I was 11, and I've been here ever since.
And what's the language of Fiji?
The official language is English. Fiji was a British colony until 1970. Half of the population speaks the indigenous language, which is Itoke, and other half speaks Hindi. Half the population is indentured from India. So we have Chinese, Indian, and local people. We are all called Fijians, but until recently there was a lot of different ethnic separations between the people here.
The Indians that live in Fiji, they were brought by the British?
That's correct. They were brought in the late 19th century to work on the sugar plantations. And that's a bit like what happened maybe in other countries with the Chinese. So my dad was a third generation Indo-Fijian, and he met my mother in India. So that's how came to be my link with Fiji, through my mother and father.
What is it about Fiji that keeps you there?
Well, actually, I didn't have much choice at the time. I was 11 years old. I just followed my mother. I was born in India, actually. So when I moved to France, my dad was working in the UK. My dad left Fiji when he went to study medicine in India. And my parents met in India. My mother was actually French, but born also in India from French parents in the French colony of Pondicherry. And then, while I was in France, my dad passed away. And my mom decided to come to Fiji to visit my dad's family. So at that time, it was my first time here. And it was a bit of a hard time for my mother to find work here. And I went to school. I didn't speak English when I arrived, so I had to learn English.
What was school like for you as a 10-year-old coming from France to Fiji?
Well, very different, because first of all, I didn't speak English. I only spoke French at the time. And the level of schooling was very different. The language was a big barrier at the beginning. I didn't know what the teacher was saying or my schoolmates were saying, but at that age, you learn English quite fast. Between a few months, I began to speak the language and listen. And when I did understand, the curriculum seemed a bit like too easy because the level was different. And so I managed to jump classes, but yeah, it was a bit difficult. And the other thing was wearing uniform because of the British system in Fiji. I didn't have to wear uniform in France. I had to wear hair, and so very different lifestyle. But we get used to it when we were young.
And were the kids accepting of you?
Oh, yeah, that was not a problem. Very, very friendly. The people in the Pacific are really friendly. In France, I had some problems because of my mixed heritage. My mother was French, but my dad was Indo-Fijian, so where I was staying in France, they were all mostly white people, and they could tell that I was not as white as them. And so in school, I was suffering quite a lot. And I didn't have many friends because of those attitudes. Racism, it was quite evident in some places, especially in small villages in France. Not if you go to Paris or big cities, but in some of the rural areas. So when I came to Fiji, everyone was accepting me as I was, and it was great. So I went to high school in Fiji. Then while I was in high school, that's when I started to become interested in shortwave radio, mostly to be able to hear some French language on the air, such as Radio France International, for instance. At the time, there was no television in Fiji, no FM radio. So it was a very different life than what I had in France, of course.
Now, Fiji being as large as you say it is, it has electricity, it has gasoline for cars and trucks. It's not like you were on a desert island.
No, but let's say there was not the same infrastructure that you would have in a developed country. We are in a developing country. So in 1978, for instance, there were not so many cars. Television was only introduced in Fiji in 1985. And FM radio around the same time as well. So it was a very different lifestyle.
So you started this interest in shortwave radio in order to listen off the island. Was there an amateur radio community there?
Well, I was staying was in Lautoka, which is the second largest city in Fiji. So I didn't know anything much about amateur radio until about 1982. While I was listening, I had bought for my birthday, I received a shortwave radio called the IC7 2001, which was a Sony receiver which had SSB on it. And so we used to listen on SSB, and I came across amateurs on SSB, and I did hear a station from Fiji, 3D2 Echo Radio. His name was Raj, and he was in Suva, the capital city. At the time, I was in my third year of high school, and so I was very interested in amateur radio, and I wrote a letter to Raj and asked him how to become a radio amateur. I don't think he realized my age, and he wrote back a letter to me, which I still have, and he said, "Dear sir, you have to pass such and such license, and then you'll get a Fiji radio license." Of course, I couldn't do much at the time. I was still in high school, but when I reached university, that was in 1985, I came to Suva, and I went to see Raj, 3D2ER, and then he showed me his shack and explained to me about ham radio, and so that's how I got to know more about the hobby.
Did you have an interest in electronics up to that point at all?
Oh, yes. since I was about 10 years old, I love to take apart radios and electronic things, always tinkering. And of course, materially, I didn't have much because we were a bit of a hardship situation when I came to Fiji, because my mom had lost her husband and didn't find much of a job in Fiji. So whatever I could find, I used to play with for electronics, which was mostly second-hand things I found. But I made quite a few interesting projects, even using Morse code when I was in high school. And yes, my interest in electronics was always there.
Now, do you have siblings, brothers and sisters?
No, I was only child.
What did you pursue in your studies after high school?
My interest in high school I was in biology and physics. So when I went to university, I did my degree major in biology and with a minor in physics, electronics and communications. But once I had my degree, then I was offered a scholarship for a master's, and it was in marine botany. So I went in the biology field. I was also offered, I think at the time, a medical scholarship, but for some reasons we chose the master's in biology. And so my career went into biology from that time.
So that's marine ecosystems and things like that. You seem like that's the ideal place in the world to be.
Yes, I was quite specialized after in marine botany, which is a taxonomy, studying about plants and describing new species, genera, a floristic aspect of biology. So, of course, that allowed me to go to several islands, which were interesting also from the radio side. That's another story, of course.
How important is the biology of the sea to the health of the world?
Well, the ocean comprises most of our planet, so it's very important to keep it healthy. And currently, with the impacts of human activity, climate change, global warming, and pollution, all ecosystems are at risk. And so part of my work at the moment is climate change adaptation. I'm monitoring things like seawater temperature, ocean acidification, sea level rise. So it's very important to know what's going on in the ocean and to minimize our impact on it.
I think those of us who are mainlanders who don't live on the islands have this idyllic sense that living on an island would be paradise and that there wouldn't be any hardships. What do you think about that?
Yes, well, that's very true. It's to do with development. They're all developing countries, those islands. Hardships, take the instance of Ratuma, for instance. Before they were joined to Fiji, they were self-reliant because people only relied on what they plant and what they fish. They had no need for anything else of the modern world. They didn't know about it and they were very happy. But once they learned of the modern world, then they want things. So now, and to sustain that Western lifestyle, you need to work and get money and jobs, and that's how it all starts. People leave the island to come to the cities, and they cannot afford to pay rent, so they live in slums and squatters. So if they want to, they can go back to their home villages, and they can live happily. But then they're accustomed now to different things. They want radios, TVs, cars, expensive clothes, to eat processed foods, So,
on the one hand, it sounds good before you have it, and then when you get it, it's actually not that good for you.
Yeah. It's like when I came to Fiji at that time, it was very different lifestyle. From a very developed place in France, I came to a place that had no running water. Electricity was where I was staying, where there was no electricity, no water, no radio, no TV, nothing. So for a kid, 10 years old, it's like adventure for a few months, but then you start to miss so many things. And that's what got me to, I needed that contact, back to where I was before and trying to listen to friends. And that's what got me in the radio. It's an interesting story, but, I was desperate for some, Western news or world, know what's happening, like you're out of touch. It's like you step in a time machine out of.
Does Fiji and the islands around it, does it try to take a no-harm approach to getting rid of its waste material? Is there a process that's well thought out? And is that something that you contribute to as a person who lives in Fiji and works in the university?
Well, Fiji has some treaties, of course, signatories to different climate change agreements, the United Nations Sustainable Goals as well. So there are a lot of NGOs and associations working in the country for those questions. At university, we have programs on ecosystems and also how to preserve the environment. So there's a lot of awareness about this in all of the Pacific Islands because we are most at risk from sea level rise and the loss of resources because we depend on the sea much more than perhaps landlocked countries in Europe or in North America. So it's very important for us, this question of preserving the ocean.
And now this message from ICOM America. You may know that ICOM America has been supplying radios to North American market for almost 50 years. You may not know that ICOM makes communication solutions for aviation, land mobile, and marine as well. As hurricane season kicks off in June and wildfire season is upon the West, ICOM has advanced emergency communication systems for emergency organizations, including your ARES, that would survive the loss of commercial infrastructures that serve these areas. In addition to ICOM's line of amateur radio products, including D-Star digital, HF, and analog radios, ICOM now has their new IC-SAT 100 portable push-to-talk satellite communicators and the IP501H and M LTE radios to offer very wide area communications for those state and region-wide emergencies. ICOM's IC-SAT 100 is the perfect handheld satellite radio for use outside of cellular or push-to-talk network range. By operating on Iridium's constellation of satellites, the IC-SAT 100 can quickly and easily connect with other push-to-talk devices from virtually anywhere. Mobile versions are also available. The IC-SAT 100 includes an emergency call button, the AquaQuake feature, which is an IP67 waterproof rating, and a vibrating function that keeps water out of the speaker. It has AES 256-bit encryption and a voice recording function. The IP501H and the IP501M radios provide instant wide area coverage over LTE. By using an LTE network, you bypass the need for pre-existing push-to-talk infrastructure, allowing nationwide coverage without the added cost of building and maintaining your own repeater network. A mobile version is available. These radios include priority interrupt calling, individual, group, talk group, multiplex, talk group, and all calls, emergency button, lone worker feature, and man-down functions, vibration alert notifications. Connect to all of these devices and more, even systems operating on different protocols, with the VE-PG4 ROIP or Radio over Internet Protocol Gateway. From land mobile and LTE radios to IP communication terminals and IP phone systems, they all work together to form one seamless and uninterrupted network, ensuring your emergency comms are received and forwarded. The VE-PG4 is your bridge connection between radio systems, an LTE transceiver gateway, an IP phone interconnect, a multi-site connection between other VE-PG4s, external equipment connection. ICOM's VE-PG4 solves all of your interoperability needs. Emergency communications groups and amateurs that serve them have complex communications needs, often beyond what amateur radio alone can solve. ICOM has the solutions to bridge any disaster situation to keep emergency personnel in touch. To learn more about these essential communication products from ICOM, click on the link in this week's show notes pages. And now back to our QSO Today. Are plastic bottles and disposable plastics, are they used in the islands, in the South Seas there?
There's a lot of plastic waste everywhere, and it also circulates in the ocean. So microplastic pollution is a big problem in the Pacific. All over the world it is, but especially here because it's found in all marine organisms, and it's also eventually will get into the human food chain. So plastic waste is very, very bad for the environment. Large plastic can kill turtles, dolphins, but the microplastic also gets its way in the food chain and PCBs and all of those waste it's a big problem, definitely.
I see the amount of plastic bottles that are used here, and it amazes me that people just can't wash a glass out. Let's go back to your ham radio story. When did you get your first license then?
Well, like I was saying before, I was inquiring about how to get amateur license with Raj 3D2AG. So at the time, Fiji's licensing requirements had the City and Guilds of London Institute Radio Amateur examination as the requirement. So I studied for that exam in 1987, and after 6 months, I got the certificate in December 1987. And then I had to sit for a Morse test, which was compulsory at the time with the Fiji Telecommunication Authority. There was a National Telecommunication Training Center at the time where I went, and I had to sit for a 13 word per minute Morse code test. So, of course, I'd studied for that for some months before listening to coast stations and random Morse on the air. There was not much in the way of material available in Fiji at the time, no CDs or online resources, so we had to do it with what we had. And Raj helped me a lot. He gave me a hand key and coached me on how to send Morse and receiving. So I did sit for that. And then in February of 1987, I obtained my first license, which was the call sign 3D2AG. And it's been with me ever since, that call sign.
Are there multiple classes of licenses there in Fiji?
No, it was, I guess, a legacy of the British administration. Before 3D2 was a VR2, so there were a lot of amateurs with the VR2 call sign prior to 1970, but they were mostly, all of them were expatriates. There were no local amateurs until the late 60s. I think Raj 1964 was the first local amateur station here, which was 3D2AG. And there's only one class, and it requires a 13 word per minute Morse exam and a theory test.
And that gives you pretty much full band coverage, including the areas of the band that might be considered extra class or class A in other countries.
I think it probably is equivalent to the CPT Class A, yes. I had an equivalence done in French Polynesia for my Fiji license, and it was equivalent to that.
And what was your first rig?
The first radio I had, which I actually had bought before I had my license while I was in Australia. It's very hard to get radios in Fiji, so while traveling, I bought this Yaesu ICOM Yaesu FT757GX 1987, and it's still working, but that was my first radio, and it lasted for a long time until I bought the ICOM 706 in 1998, which was my second radio.
Is that the radio you use now?
The radio I use now is the ICOM 7300. I do have all my radios still working, but since there's no ham shop in Fiji, I can only get new radios when I'm traveling. So the second radio I bought was while I was in Japan for a work conference. In Akihabara, I got a 706. And in 2010, I went again to Japan for another meeting and got the 7300. Also, a few other radios I got from people who unfortunately passed away. 3D2BA passed away in 2016, and I got some radios from his silent estate. And in French Polynesia, I got TS440 Sugar from FO5 Papa Sierra. So I got a few radios, but all of them are different brands, and I have to keep them going because it's very hard to replace them. And I do mostly my own repairs on them.
How many active hams are there in Fiji now?
Active hams at the moment we have 3. Myself, 3D2 Mike Papa, which is a local ham, and we have an expatriate Phil 3D2 TS. There's a long list of amateurs licensed, but they're either not active or they're only visitors, which are listed, but they are not here at the moment.
Is the South Pacific environment, the Fiji environment, is it hard on the radios? I mean, do you have to deal a lot with corrosion, and how do you keep the radios in tip-top shape?
Yes, it's a tropical country with a humid, hot climate, so corrosion is a big problem. Also insects. humidity, moisture. So there are a lot of issues, yes, to keep the radios. Mostly we have to keep them on all the time. If you don't use equipment for a while, then you'll get a lot of problems. And also with capacitors that get bulging and to do with the heat and humidity mostly.
If there's 3 active hams in Fiji, and when you talk about 3 active hams, you're talking about Fiji and the islands around Fiji that's kind of all part of the state?
Yes, all the hams are in the main island, which is Viti Levu. Fiji consists of 300 islands, 2 main islands, and 90% of the population almost is in the main island here in Viti Levu. And there are no hams in any of the outer islands. There used to be a ham on the second largest island, 3D2AG, I think Ruvan Prasad, but he migrated many years ago. So all of the hams now are in Suva, which is the capital city of Fiji.
This is probably why when one looks at your QRZ page that you have a lot of information about DX, because I would assume that if there's only 3 active hams in Fiji, that anytime you're on the air, people want to work you. Does that sound right?
Well, to be honest, Fiji nowadays is not rare as it used to be. Not because of local hams, but mostly because of the expeditions from foreign countries that came here over the years. So most of the demand for Fiji has been taken away by these foreign stations. So it's not like when I started ham radio, I used to call CQ and would immediately get a pileup. These days I can call CQ, especially on CW or voice, and nobody comes back to me. But on FT8, people still need Fiji. So times have changed. And each of the 3 hams have different modes that they prefer. I like CW, for instance. Mike Papa is only on sideband, while TS is only FT8. So we complement each other, I guess. But it's very different these days from what it used to be, say, 20 years ago in Fiji.
Do you operate any repeaters or any VHF, UHF, or microwave modes from Fiji?
Well, with only 3 hams, we really don't need a repeater, but we never had a repeater here. There was planned to have one. The 3D2 Alpha, who was a Rotuman ham, planned to install one, but unfortunately he passed away before anything could happen, and we lacked the resources, and so we don't have any 2-meter network. Although I do have 2 meters at home where we can speak to, for instance, Mike Papa on 2 meters or TS, but not across the island at the moment.
Now, what's the relationship between Fiji and Rotuma? Because it appears to me that you go back and forth quite a lot.
Yes, it's my relationship with Rotuma started in 1991, but Fiji and Rotuma are very distinct geographically. It's only a political link. Actually, it's a Polynesian island, Rotuma, and it was annexed by Britain to Fiji in 1891, around about that time. So it's a very different culture and climate than mainland Fiji.
I think it's due north of Fiji. And how far north is it?
It's about 600 kilometers north, which is why it qualifies as a separate DXCC country. It takes about 2 days by boat. And the first time I went there was actually for ham radio, because I knew 3D2 Alpha, and he invited me to his brother's home there. That's how I went for the first time. The second time I went was for my work, because I did a master's, and the subject of my master's degree was the marine flora of Ratuma Island. So I went for 6 months and went collecting seaweeds all around, and I had a long stay at that time.
Let me take a quick break to tell you about my favorite amateur radio audio podcast, and that's the Ham Radio Workbench podcast with George, KJ6VU, Jeremy, KF7IJZ, and it now includes Michael Walker, VA3MW, where they pursue topics, technology, and projects on their ham radio workbenches every 2 weeks. The group documents their projects and makes circuit boards available to their listeners. They have interesting guests and go in deep. Jeremy may complain about the overall length of the podcast, but friends, let me tell you that I could listen to it all day, and that's good. Even if you are a seasoned ham radio builder or just getting started, Be sure to join George, Jeremy, and Mike now for the Ham Radio Workbench podcast on every podcast player. Use the link on this week's show notes page by clicking on the image. A new way to show your support of the QSO Today podcast is to buy me a coffee. I consume gallons of coffee to create this weekly podcast. Invite me for coffee by pushing the yellow button, Buy Me a Coffee, on the QSO Today show notes page. And now back to our QSO Today. The island of Ratuma is what may only have a couple thousand inhabitants?
That's correct, yes. Maybe about 2,500 at this time.
It looks like it has an airport on the north end, a high school with a soccer field kind of near the airport, and then there's a scattering of houses all along the edge. What holds Ratuma together? Does it have an economy? Is it sugar cane or something like that?
Well, Ratuma has always been self-reliant. The population there does farming, fishing. There is a copra, which is a coconut. So they don't really need money to survive, to eat, or they're always proud of that. So, but of course, a lot of Rotumans migrate to Fiji now and to send money back home, and so that people have, of course, these days luxuries of modern living. They don't only survive on farming and fishing. So it's becoming more developed, but there's a very strong sense of community on the island, and there are 14 districts with villages, and it's a very close-knit community. And the Rotuman diaspora all around the world, there are much more Rotumans overseas than on the island itself. So there's quite a lot of Rotumans in Fiji and in Australia, Europe, North America, many countries in the world.
Is Ratuma a ham radio destination?
Well, it became one in 1988 when, because of the distance, it was asked to become a new DXCC country. And from that time, 3D2 X-ray the expedition, which was an American, I think, the expedition, people have been going to the island. You may not be aware, I think the first expedition to Ratuma was by a German ham in 1982, but it was not approved for DXCC at the time for some strange reason about intervening rocks between Fiji and Ratuma. But the 3D2 X-ray team confirmed that there were no rocks, so DXCC desk approved that operation, but that was really the second ham radio operation from the island in 1988.
How often do you go, and what takes you there so frequently?
Well, once I spent some time on the island, I went there every year, mostly for amateur radio, because I liked very much the island and the community. And so I've been going there every year, mostly for that, doing a bit of ham radio during the holidays. 2008, I met my wife there, so I got married to a Rotuman, and that further strengthened my link to the island, I guess.
But now you have a family link and a reason to go back and forth.
That's correct.
Are there other islands around Fiji that you like to frequent for ham radio?
Well, I would like to go to some places such as, for instance, Conway Reef or some of the rare iotas, but it's about resources. Being only 3 of us, and basically I'm the only DXer around here, it takes resources. So on my own, I couldn't do it, especially places like Conway. But in a team, yes, I would love to go one day. I've never been there yet, so we'll see. But definitely, yes, I would like to go around. I've been to a few other islands in the Pacific on the expedition, but that was mostly linked to my work as well.
Do you receive many amateur radio operators in Fiji who come on vacation who expect to operate?
Yes, there was many that came through, and with some of them we invited home. So if you go on my QRZ.com page, you will see many pictures of some of the visitors we hosted. And I always enjoy receiving amateurs from all over the world here. I think the human contact is very important in our hobby, and especially with modes like sideband and even CW, we get the human contact, which is very important. We're tending to lose that now with digital modes and FT8, sadly.
If you knew that you had some ham radio guests coming to visit you, what would you like them to bring with them that they could leave with you?
Well, To be polite, I never asked openly that kind of thing from visitors, but, they do know our situation, so they're always very sympathetic to the amateurs in the islands, and most of them always leave something behind, and so I'm really grateful for that ham spirit, and that enabled me to build some of my stations. But of course, if I need something, for instance, some component or something to repair an antenna or a radio, I can ask them and even offering to reimburse them. And so they're always very helpful in that respect. That's very, very good, yes.
Well, I figure, they're going to spend thousands of dollars to get to Fiji, that to bring a box of PL259s and crimp connectors, crimpers, things like that, things that you might not be able to get, wouldn't be too bad.
Oh, yes. That's very, very helpful for us. Things that maybe are so easy to get overseas are very hard to find here. You may be surprised. So people have been very kind to us, and so we're always grateful, and we keep lifelong friendship with many hams in the world that have come through here. And I've also had the chance to visit a few while I was away overseas on the work trips. And so it's a very good exchange, I think.
I think some people might be wondering whether or not you can actually buy online things from like AliExpress or eBay or something like that. Are you able to do that, and are you able to get deliveries there, although they might take a while?
For the last 2 years, we've been able to buy online. The big problem with buying online is that there is a very high custom duty in Fiji, about 70% on equipment plus freight, so it gets quite expensive to order online, which people in Fiji being relatively poor, so 70% of the population lives below the poverty line in Fiji. Those with jobs are fortunate. And so equipment is sometimes not a priority, and it does take a bit of the budget of family.
Is Fiji a quiet island in terms of electronic noise?
Well, until about 10 years ago, it was, yes, very quiet. And some places still are, like Ratuma. But sadly, where I live in Suva in Fiji now, it's quite a hell regarding noise. I cannot even go on CW sometime because of a terrible QRN, and that's mostly caused by equipment that's brought in the country from Asia, China, which is not properly filtered. And even our power station here nearby my QTH, there is a power station which uses huge transformers, high voltage lines, and they radiate a lot of noise. So it's been terrible for the last 5 years here, unfortunately.
Do you experiment with, say, loop antennas and other ways of trying to cancel the noise? Or do you just find it's just easier to go someplace else?
We're fighting a lot with that noise. It's always a war against QRNC. So I'm very glad when I go out of the main island and I'm able to enjoy again ham radio as it used to be many years ago.
With you and your son, what's your next project? I'm assuming that you do ham radio projects, or you do projects, or you do things like that with him.
He's at school. He's 9 years old, so he's schooling at the moment. He does have an interest in radio, and I teach him a bit of Morse code when he has the time. So I think it will come. I'm not forcing anything, but I hope he can get more interest in the hobby and probably get his call before long.
When you go to Ratuma or something like that, does he go with you?
Yes, of course. There's only two of us, so we go, especially because in 2020 I lost my eldest son while on the expedition in Ratuma. And so we go and visit my eldest son's grave, and we hope to do that this year. If not because of COVID-19, we'll go next year.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. I saw that in your video. What's the next big ham radio project, or next big de-expedition once the COVID lifts?
Well, right now the priority is keeping safe with COVID-19. We don't know when we'll be able to travel again. We cannot travel for Ratuma or any of the islands until further notice. So I think that will have to be on hold until the situation improves here with COVID-19 and travel. But I would like to go to a place like Conway, for instance, on both a biological expedition as well as a ham radio. That would have to be in a team situation, maybe a scientific operation as well as radio operation, which is, I think, a good formula for this type of event.
Are you also a scuba diver?
Yes, I've been scuba diving since 1995 for my work, and when I need to, I dive, yes.
Are you a certified scuba trainer as well?
I have an open water license, but I only dive when I need to for my work. I never do any recreational diving, or I've never been interested in that side of diving. It's to me, diving is a tool which I use for my work, and when I need to collect samples. Or, for instance, right now we have a project with seawater monitoring, so I dive to sites to deploy data loggers that monitor temperature. So we have one in Ratuma. So when I go on the expedition, I also take diving gear so we can have a look at our data logger and replace the logger and download the data. So it's part of my work at the moment.
So your data logger, it retains its information and you have to actually retrieve the data. It doesn't go via satellite or something like that?
Yes, it's deployed in the field for up to 12 to 24 months. And we have about 11 stations around Fiji, one being in Ratuma, and it would be nice to have one in Conway, for instance. That would give us also an opportunity to visit.
How would people outside of Fiji support your work?
You mean in my work?
Yeah, the work that you're doing in, say, for example, examining changes in the oceans, the ocean temperature, climate change. Is your work sponsored by any nonprofit organizations?
Well, it's part of my work at the University of the South Pacific, where I've been employed for a long time. So my profession there, I'm a senior lecturer, so I do teaching and research. I have an online course on ecosystems and marine environment, coral reef, and research involves this climate change monitoring, ocean acidification monitoring, and climate change adaptation. So it's all part of my job, really.
Since the COVID-19 pandemic and everyone being locked down, it seemed to me that around the world, amateur radio clubs came online. Have you been able to take advantage of any amateur radio activities that are now online that allow you to participate?
Yes, I had the pleasure to attend a few online amateur radio expositions for the last 2 years. And so it's been a very enjoyable way to go back to the ham community and virtually meet other hams. The last real ham exposition I went to was in Germany in 2016. So since then that was my first and last actually ham fest.
That was probably the Friedrichshafen Ham Fest in 2016?
That's right, yes. Quite an amazing experience. I was visiting some German amateur radio operators whom I had the pleasure also to invite at my home before. So we developed a good friendship with hams in Europe as well as North America and many countries in the world.
From your perspective as a ham in Fiji, what do you think is the biggest challenge to amateur radio right now?
I think personally, one is the encroachment of the amateur spectrum by other services. In Fiji, we have a lot of mobile network. And the other one is noise, which is also polluting the spectrum. So those are two threats to actually our spectrum. We also have the danger of losing amateurs because there's no recruitment much going on. The young people are losing interest in the hobby, so we have to revive the hobby. I'm also part of the IRU Region 3 group that's looking at IRU over the next 50 years or so, and so we discuss these problems. And so I hope that some solutions can come about so that we can both safeguard the spectrum as well as revive interest in the hobby, perhaps highlighting various new aspects of ham radio than the traditional ones.
And those would be what, like digital modes, whisper, things like that?
Some of them could be that, and also the social aspects as well as emergency telecommunications, how we can help in terms of MCOM, how we can help people gain technical expertise. So there are many, of course, facets to amateur radio, including EME, space, satellites. But digital modes is something that will attract, I think, a lot of young people. Not, of course, to forget about the legacy modes like SSB and CW. which are more of a human link than digital modes. Incidentally, my first operation was on the FT101. You know that radio, the 101 Echo?
Yeah, for sure.
Great radio.
Yeah, I got one under the desk here I'm supposed to fix.
Raj sold it to someone. He regretted selling it, but that was actually the first ever radio I operated before I had my 757 GX. Because when I bought it in 87, I didn't have a license, so the Fiji customs put it on bond for 1 year.
Really?
Yeah, because I didn't have yet my license. So while I was training, I used to go to Raj's home, and that time it was full open on 10 meters and 6 meters, and it was a wonderful time. So I kind of grew up in the fire of the hobby. Everything was open. SSB on 10 meters to Europe. Incredible at that time. Now we can't even go FT8 on 10 meters to Europe. But hopefully it will come back in a couple of years. Let's see how this cycle behaves.
6 meters seems to be acting kind of very interesting.
Yes, I got some good openings to North America in April, Japan, but not like before. Before it was really good.
You say you're using the 7300 with a display on the front, the waterfall display?
Yes, IC 7300.
Yeah, I have one myself. I love it.
I think 3D2TS got another radio. He's working for NGO, and he's got tax-free access to rigs. So he's got, and I think, the better model, the latest something. But this one is good.
Yeah, this is a good entry-level radio. It's better than anything I've ever had.
Yeah. But I still have, I got FT897, which is good as well. That's donated by MCOM Australia for MCOM use.
And that also has UHF and VHF.
Yes, so I use that for 2 meters as well.
And how does that work? You work 2 meter CW?
Yeah, it's good. It's a good. Only problem is the menu is very hard to work. You have to get used to the menu. Much complicated than the icon. But once you know, then it's okay. But otherwise, but it's very robust. It's
Who do you work on 2 meters CW from Fiji?
Well, if I did contact New Zealand on 2 meters tropo here on when it's open. Very rare, but it happens. So I have a few CW, even did RTTY on this on 2 meters. We did all modes. Someone wanted all modes on 2 meters, so we went SSB, CW, RTTY, FT8, FT4, and then AM, and then FM. We did the whole works.
Did the whole thing. Do you hear beacons from Fiji?
On which band?
On any band.
The 6 meters beacon, sometimes, yes, when it's open, but on 2 meters I never heard any beacon. But on 6, yes. But now beacons, people say that whisper is better than a beacon. So, but I still believe that the CW beacon can tell you really when the band is open better than whisper.
If you're a CW operator.
No, it's not only that. It's because whisper is the long cycle. There's 2-3 minutes between cycles. And the opening can last 30 seconds. Within that 30 seconds, you can walk someone on CW. Or even less than 15 seconds, you can make a QSO on CW. And with the CW beacon, you immediately know that it's open. And so to me, it's much faster and efficient if you know how to work it.
Do you use like PSK Reporter or something like that to watch the bands?
Yes, I have that. Clusters. So I think they're all different tools. You cannot say one tool is better. They all complement each other. If the opening is really short, then you have to use CW, in my opinion, on 6 meters. If it's or FT4 maybe, or FT8 if it's long enough. Then there's the question of the weakness of the signal. If it's really weak, FT8 wins because it can pick out until minus 26, 30.
We've had a really good conversation here on Zoom. What kind of internet service do you have there?
I got 4G at home. I had another service before that was really bad. So now it's getting 5G into Fiji. It's getting better. It used to be not so good, but with competition and different providers, it's getting better. We have optical cable between Fiji, North America, and Australia since a couple of years. So speed has improved.
You're part of an optical cable that runs...
Yes, the Trans-Pacific cable, and Fiji, one of the hubs here. Right, yeah.
Did you have like wired internet to your house, or did Fiji's model be a wireless model?
Well, it started, internet only came to Fiji in about 2000 and something, I think. Before that, only the education organizations like the universities had internet access and government. But for private individuals, maybe it's only 20 years since we have internet. And it used to be first landline based, dial-up. Then it moved to higher speed modems about 10 years ago.
So DSL?
Yeah, kind of, because it's a distributed system. So we don't get ADSL speed really, I think. But about 10 years now, we have wireless, different types. It was not so good at the beginning, but now we have 4G. So I use 4G at home here, wireless.
So you have some kind of a outdoor modem router?
No, it's an indoor modem that picks up 4G, which is in the 900 megahertz or something. And then that I got then the Wi-Fi at home, I distribute it.
This has really been good. I mean, we've had a very nice, reliable conversation.
It's okay. I'm using the PC now directly wired to the modem because I use this PC for the SDR on the RBN network, and it requires direct connection to the modem. So, and I got my son playing. I think my son is playing his video game, so he's using part of the bandwidth on his video game.
I think that when we go audio only, like we're going right now, I think that we're probably 6K versus 1 meg or 2 megs or more.
I get good speed. If I want to download something, it's pretty fast. It's okay. But this is one provider. The provider I had before was not so good. So you have to choose the right one.
Is the internet kind of a game changer for Fiji? Is it allowing people to work off the island, maybe work remotely?
Oh, yes, it was. It is. It's very connected now. The government is favoring people being connected, and there's no tax on IT equipment, tablets, mobile phones. So everybody is now connected, Facebook, YouTube, you name it, from the high school kids, even primary school people they're very literate online now. It's also sometimes can be a danger for the content.
Is it providing educational opportunities for Fijians so that they can actually use a service like Upwork or something like that, so they could maybe be coders on the island for companies offshore?
Probably, yes. There are quite a few people working for companies, call companies. They hire people here for their call centers. There are people who work for those, education. And also now with COVID-19, we have Zoom and meetings, Skype, all those. I'm working from home at the moment. All the staff for university are working from home, most of them.
So you're providing lectures from home?
Yeah, we're teaching online, most of us at the moment.
And how's that going?
So it's okay. The students are getting used to it. I think that will be the way to go. Most universities are going online.
Do you have a lot of interaction with hams that sail through the area?
There are, over the years, hams that sail, yes, that come through, and many of the yacht community in the Pacific have amateur radio licenses, but they are not DXs. They only use that to communicate between themselves. So I do not have too much of contact, but we have a few coming over the years, and we had the Auckland to Suva yacht race, where local amateurs used to participate in years past, but that hasn't happened for many years now.
What most excites you about amateur radio right now?
I think what still interests me is making DXing, contacting countries, and mostly it's giving out new countries that from our perspective. I was brought up in ham radio as a DX station, so to me I started operating in a pilot, so it gives us a different kind of view of amateur radio than being on the other side where one is chasing DX. We are being chased, and also we like to give new countries and give new contacts. So it's about more giving from our side, I think, than looking for countries for certificates or diplomas. So it's a different side of DXing from a DX perspective.
You said that CW is your favorite operating mode. Do you operate a straight key or bug?
I got a paddle. I started with a straight key, but doing a pile-up is not very good using for a long time on a straight key. But I always use a manual paddle. I had a bencher, and I have a few others now that I got from trips and hams. But I never use a computer to send Morse or decode Morse. I think that's To me, it's not good to use computers for most, which is an art. It's a human mode, I think, only.
What advice would you give to new or returning hams to the hobby?
Well, if you've been a ham for a long time before, I think you will find things have changed now, especially with regard to digital modes and the human contact in amateur radio. So I would say to always keep in mind that it's about building friendship between amateurs around the world, and try and always think of the person behind the call sign. And if you're on digital modes, try and find out more about the station you're working, rather than leaving your computer doing the work for you. And keep occupied with different modes, keep abreast of what's going on, and find something that you find exciting in the hobby and try and keep at it. As long as you're happy with what you're doing in the hobby, I think it's good. There's a lot of things for everybody in amateur radio.
Antoine, I want to thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. I'm going to put a link to the Expo presentation that you made in March, which is Challenges in Paradise, 30 Years of Ratuma Expeditions, in the show notes so that people can find that and actually hear and see you make this presentation, which also gives some history of your ham radio life there in Fiji and on Ratuma. And I want to thank you so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast and wish you 73.
Well, it was a pleasure, Eric, to speak to you today. I hope some of my history was useful and will be of help to some people who want to become amateur radio operators. Thank you very much again, and I wish you a very good day there. Best 73.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Antoine. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in 3D2AG in the search box at the top of the page. Be sure to click on the Expo menu item at the top of the page for updates on the upcoming QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo. I'm updating it as I have more information. My thanks to ICOM America for its support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of ICOM America by clicking on their banner in the show notes pages. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any other episode into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages, or use my Amazon link before shopping at Amazon. Amazon gives me a small commission on your purchases while at the same time protecting your privacy. I'm grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference as I head towards episode 400. QSO Today is now available in the iHeart Radio, Spotify, YouTube, and a bunch of other online audio services, including the iTunes Store. Look on the right side of the show notes pages for a listing of these services. You can use the Amazon Echo and say, "Alicia, play the QSO Today podcast from TuneIn." My thanks to Ben Bresky, who edits every single show and allows both this host and my guest to sound brilliant. Thanks, Ben. Until next time, this is Eric, 4Z1UG, 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.